The lecture hall fell silent the moment Professor Richard Caldwell held up the equation, his thin smile cutting across his face like a blade. Maya sat 3 rows from the front, her second-hand notebook open, her mechanical pencil still. She had learned long ago not to draw attention to herself, not to raise her hand too quickly, not to let her eyes reveal what she understood before others had even finished reading the problem. But today was different. Today, Professor Caldwell had made it personal. "This," he announced, tapping the board with satisfaction, "is a problem that has stumped graduate students. I present it to you not because I expect anyone in this room to solve it, but because I want you to understand the limits of your current comprehension. If anyone here can solve this before the end of this class period, I will personally ensure they receive an A for the entire semester. No further attendance required." The other students shifted in their seats, some laughing nervously, others leaning back in resignation. Maya stared at the board. The equation sprawled across the whiteboard in Professor Caldwell's precise handwriting, a complex integration problem involving multivariable calculus and differential equations. Her mind had already begun working through it, seeing the pathways, recognizing the patterns. She had seen problems like this before, not in a classroom. In her father's office years ago, when the world had been different. Professor Caldwell's eyes swept the room with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged, never been proven wrong in a space he controlled. "No takers? Good. Then let's discuss why this problem represents the threshold between undergraduate posturing and actual mathematical maturity." Maya's hand moved. She didn't raise it. She simply began writing. Her pencil touched paper and the numbers flowed, each step precise, each transformation clear. She had learned mathematics the way some children learn languages, by immersion, by necessity, by survival. Her father had been a mathematician before the accident, before the medical bills, before everything fell apart. She was 8 years old when her father first showed her a proof, not as a lesson but as a conversation. He would sit at their kitchen table, the small apartment filled with the smell of her mother's cooking, and he would talk through problems the way other fathers talked about sports or movies. He never simplified for her. He never spoke down. He treated her mind as something worthy of complex things, beautiful things, true things. When her mother died 2 years later, a sudden aneurysm that took her in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, mathematics became their shared language of grief. They would sit together in silence, and he would write equations, and she would solve them, and neither of them had to say that they were drowning. The accident happened when Maya was 13. Her father was driving home from a conference, a 3-hour trip he had made dozens of times. The other driver was texting. The police said her father might have survived if the ambulance had arrived sooner, but they were in a rural area, and response times were delayed, and by the time he reached the hospital, the internal bleeding had already done its damage. He lived for 3 more days, conscious enough to hold her hand, to tell her that her mind was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed, that she should never let anyone diminish it. Never let anyone make her small. He died on a Saturday morning while she sat beside him, reading aloud from a mathematics journal, because it was the only thing that seemed to calm him. Maya was placed with her aunt, her father's sister, a woman who worked 2 jobs and resented every moment of having to care for a teenager who wasn't hers. There was no money for the things Maya had taken for granted before. No money for books, for tutoring, for the academic summer programs her father had enrolled her in every year. Her aunt made it clear that Maya was expected to contribute to work, to not be a burden. So Maya worked. She cleaned houses on weekends. She tutored younger students for cash under the table. She applied for every scholarship, every grant, every opportunity that might give her a path forward. And she got into the university on a full academic scholarship, studying mathematics because it was the only thing she had left of her father. The only language they had shared that death could not erase. Professor Caldwell had hated her from the first day of class. She didn't know why initially. She had been quiet, careful not to outshine anyone, careful to wait her turn. But he seemed to sense something in her, some threat to his authority, some challenge to his position as the sole source of knowledge in the room. He began targeting her with questions designed to humiliate, calling on her at moments when he assumed she hadn't been paying attention, assigning her the most tedious problems. Marking her work with a scrutiny he applied to no one else. When she answered correctly, he would dismiss her responses as lucky guesses or rote memorization. When she asked questions, he would sigh as if she were wasting everyone's time. The other students had learned to echo his disdain. They would smirk when he called on her. They would whisper when she walked to her seat. She had no friends in this class, no allies. She was alone in the way she had been alone since her father died, surrounded by people who could not see her, who had already decided what she was worth. Maya finished the first major step of the problem and moved to the second. Her handwriting was small, precise, efficient. She had learned to write this way because paper was expensive, because her aunt begrudged every resource, because waste was a luxury she could not afford. The solution was taking shape, each line of work building on the last. She knew she was right. She could feel it the way her father had taught her to feel it, that sense of mathematical truth that existed independent of opinion or preference. Professor Caldwell was lecturing now, his voice filling the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself unchallengeable. The error most students make when approaching a problem like this is assuming that brute force will carry them through. Mathematics at this level requires elegance, intuition, a refinement of thought that frankly most of you have not yet developed and may never develop. Maya wrote faster. She was on the third transformation now, applying a substitution her father had shown her years ago. A technique she had never seen in any textbook, but which worked perfectly for problems structured like this one. She could hear his voice in her head, patient and warm, guiding her through the logic. Trust the pattern, Maya. The numbers will tell you where to go if you listen. Around her, other students had stopped even pretending to work on the problem. They were scrolling through their phones, whispering to each other, waiting for the class to end. No one was watching her. No one ever watched her. She was invisible in the way that poor girls are invisible, in the way that grief makes you invisible, translucent, a ghost moving through spaces where everyone else is solid and real. She reached the final integration. Her hand cramped slightly. She had been writing without pause for 8 minutes. The answer was emerging now, clean and inevitable. She checked her work once, then again. It was correct. She knew it was correct. She could feel the truth of it in her bones. Maya raised her hand. Professor Caldwell didn't notice at first. He was drawing something on the board, still lecturing about the theoretical foundations that made this problem unsolvable for undergraduates. When he finally turned and saw her hand in the air, his expression shifted. Irritation, dismissal, a flicker of something darker. "Yes, Miss Chen, do you have a question?" His tone was acid. The other students turned to look at her, some amused, others indifferent. Maya stood, her notebook in her hand. Her voice came out steady, quieter than she wanted, but clear. "I've solved it." The room went silent. Not the attentive silence of interest, but the thick, uncomfortable silence of disbelief laced with second-hand embarrassment. Someone in the back row laughed, a short, sharp sound quickly stifled. Professor Caldwell's face went very still. He set down his marker with deliberate care. "You've solved it." His voice was flat, each word its own sentence. "Yes, in 10 minutes. Yes," he smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Come to the board then, Miss Chen. Show us your work. Show us how you've accomplished what PhD candidates struggle with." Maya walked to the front of the class. Every step felt like moving through water. She could feel eyes on her back, could hear the whispers starting, the cruel little laughs. Her hands were shaking slightly. She hated that they were shaking. She hated that he could see her fear. But she reached the board and began to write, transcribing her work in the same careful hand, each step laid out with precision. Professor Caldwell watched. His arms were crossed. His expression was a mask of professional skepticism, but underneath it, Maya could see something else. He was checking her work as she wrote it, and he was finding nothing wrong. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes narrowed. She continued writing, her hands steadier now. The problem filled the board, each transformation, each substitution, each integration performed exactly as it needed to be. When she finished, she stepped back. The final answer stood alone at the bottom right of the board, boxed and complete. The room was utterly silent. Maya turned to face Professor Caldwell. He was staring at the board. His face had gone pale, then flushed. He said nothing. The seconds stretched. Students began to shift in their seats, confused by his silence, uncertain what was happening. Is it correct? Maya asked. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the silence. Professor Caldwell's mouth opened, closed. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had entered his class, she saw something like fear in his eyes. Fear and rage and humiliation all tangled together. He turned back to the board, his finger tracing one of her steps, looking for an error, any error, something he could use to dismiss her work. He found nothing. The solution was perfect. Where did you learn this technique? His voice was low, dangerous. My father taught me. Your father. He said it like an accusation. And who was your father? Dr. James Chen. He taught at MIT before he died. The color drained from Professor Caldwell's face. Maya watched it happen, watched recognition and something else, something worse, flash across his features. He had known her father. Of course he had. The mathematical community was small, especially at that level. Professor Caldwell had built his career on incremental advances, careful positioning, the slow accumulation of institutional power. Her father had been different. Brilliant in a way that threatened people like Caldwell, generous in a way that made their pettiness visible. Your father, Professor Caldwell said slowly, was a colleague of mine many years ago. I know, Maya said. He mentioned you once. She didn't say what her father had said. That Professor Caldwell was a man more concerned with being recognized than with being right. That he was the kind of mathematician who guarded his territory rather than expanding the field. That he was small and that smallness was a choice, not a limitation. Professor Caldwell stared at her, the silence stretched. The other students were watching now, fully attentive, sensing that something was happening beyond their understanding. Maya stood very still. She had shown her work. She had solved the problem. She had met his challenge. But she knew, with the instinct born of years of being underestimated and dismissed, that he was not going to honor his word. Men like Professor Caldwell never did, not when their pride was on the line, not when acknowledging her would mean acknowledging their own mediocrity. This technique, he said finally, his voice tight, is too advanced for you to have developed independently. I have concerns about the originality of this work. The words hung in the air like smoke. Maya felt something cold settle in her chest, accusations of academic dishonesty. He was going to accuse her of cheating rather than admit she had solved his impossible problem. She opened her mouth to respond, but a voice from the back of the lecture hall cut through the tension. I'd be interested to hear those concerns explained in detail, Richard. Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that marked him as someone important. He walked down the aisle with the casual authority of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere all at once. Maya didn't recognize him, but Professor Caldwell did. His face went from pale to ashen. Dr. Morrison, he said, his voice cracking slightly on the name. I didn't realize you were visiting campus today. Clearly, Doctor. Morrison reached the front of the room and looked at the board, studying Maya's work with the focused attention of someone who actually understood what he was seeing. He nodded slowly, then turned to Maya. Dr. James Chen's daughter, I presume? Yes, sir. I worked with your father for several years. He spoke of you often. Said you had a mind for mathematics that surpassed even his own. Dr. Morrison's voice was warm, genuinely kind. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. He was one of the finest mathematicians I've ever known, and a better man than most. Tears burned in Maya's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Thank you, Doctor. Morrison turned to Professor Caldwell. This solution is not only correct, it's elegant. The substitution technique in Step 7 is particularly clever. Original work, clearly. He paused, letting the words settle. I assume you'll be honoring your commitment to Miss Chen. An A for the semester, I believe you said. No further attendance required. Professor Caldwell looked like he had swallowed glass. Of course, he managed. I always keep my word. Excellent. Dr. Morrison smiled, but there was steel in it. I'm here for the department review meetings this week. I look forward to discussing your pedagogy and grading practices in detail. There have been some concerns raised by students about fairness and accessibility in your courses. I'm sure we'll have much to discuss. The threat was not subtle. Professor Caldwell nodded, his face rigid. Dr. Morrison turned back to Maya, his expression softening. Walk with me, Miss Chen. I'd like to talk to you about your plans after graduation. We have several graduate programs that would be fortunate to have you. Maya gathered her notebook, her hands still shaking but for different reasons now. As she walked toward the door, she glanced back once. The other students were staring, some shocked, some confused, a few looking at her with something like respect for the first time. Professor Caldwell stood frozen at the front of the room, his impossible problem still written on the board above him, solved by the girl he had tried so hard to diminish. Doctor. Morrison led her into the hallway and the door closed behind them. The noise of the lecture hall faded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maya felt exhausted, wrung out, like she had run for miles. "How did you know to come?" she asked finally. Dr. Morrison smiled. "I didn't, pure coincidence. I was meeting with the dean and happened to be walking past when I heard raised voices. I recognized your last name on the door roster. I thought I'd observe." He paused. "Your father made me promise before he died that I would watch out for you if our paths ever crossed. I didn't know you were attending this university until today. I'm glad I could keep that promise, even in a small way." Something broke open in Maya's chest. She had held herself together for so long, through so much, and the simple fact of someone keeping a promise to her dead father undid her. She cried there in the hallway, quiet tears that she wiped away quickly, but Dr. Morrison waited patiently, not uncomfortable, not rushing her. "Your father believed that mathematics was a language of truth," he said when she had composed herself. "He believed it could reveal what was real, what mattered, what endured. He saw that in you." "He was right," Maya nodded. She couldn't speak yet. "Richard Caldwell is a small man who has spent his career making himself feel large by making others feel small. He is not the last person like him you will encounter, but you have something he will never have. You have your father's gift, and more importantly, you have his integrity. Don't let people like Caldwell make you forget that." Over the following weeks, things changed. Professor Caldwell's demeanor in class became stiffly professional. He no longer called on Maya, no longer targeted her with impossible questions. He barely looked at her. The other students began to approach her differently, some with curiosity, others with a grudging respect. A few apologized for their earlier treatment, awkward and brief, but genuine. Maya accepted the apologies, but did not forget the months of isolation that had preceded them. Dr. Morrison made good on his offer. He connected her with graduate programs, wrote her recommendations, opened doors that had seemed permanently closed. She received offers from 3 top universities, full funding, stipends that would allow her to study without working multiple jobs, without rationing notebooks and pencils, without the constant grinding anxiety of poverty. She chose MIT, her father's school, his legacy. The semester ended. Maya's transcript showed an A in Professor Caldwell's course, though she had not attended a single class after that day in the lecture hall. She spent her final weeks at the university preparing for graduate school, meeting with advisors, tying up loose ends. She walked past the mathematics building one last time on her way to move out of her dorm. The doors were propped open for summer cleaning. Inside, she could see the lecture hall where it had all happened, empty now, the boards wiped clean. She thought about her father, about the way he had believed in her when she was 8 years old and showing her first proof, when she was 13 and sitting beside his hospital bed, when she was 18 and standing alone in a classroom full of people who thought she was nothing. She thought about the equation on the board, the problem meant to humble and exclude, and how solving it had felt like speaking to him one more time. Like proving that what he had given her could not be taken away by death or poverty or the cruelty of small men. Maya walked away from that building and did not look back. If you have ever been in a room where someone tried to make you small, tried to convince you that your mind or your voice or your worth was less than it truly was, you know the weight of that moment. You know how silence can become a weapon, how doubt can be planted like a seed, how easy it is to believe the cruelest versions of yourself that others project onto you. But you also know, or you will learn, that truth has a weight of its own. It is quiet, it is patient, it does not need to shout to be heard. And when you speak it, when you write it out step by step on a board in front of people who do not believe you, when you stand in your truth despite everything, you are doing what your father did. What everyone who came before you and refused to be diminished did. You are proving that small men with loud voices cannot erase what is real. They cannot solve the problems you can solve. They cannot think the thoughts you think. They cannot take from you what was never theirs to give. Maya learned this in a lecture hall in 10 minutes. But she had been learning it all her life, every day since her father first showed her that mathematics was a language of truth, and that she could speak it fluently, beautifully, undeniably. And she carries that truth forward still into every room, every challenge, every moment when someone tries to tell her she is less than she is. She carries it the way you carry yours, quietly. Certainly, like an equation that has already been solved.